Shannon, just to let you know, when Pradeep takes off this intro slide, that's your cue to start. That means you would be live, right?
Okay, sounds good.
And Patricia, could we have your video also? Because we're going to record it from this point onwards. Thank you. Pradeep, you can let the attendees in.
Yeah, we are going live now.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this special webinar on which interventions strengthen intergroup social cohesion in fragile situations. We are so glad you could all join us today. This panel, led by 3IE, is a part of the What Works Global Summit 2020. The International Initiative for Impact Evaluation is an international NGO promoting evidence-informed development, policies, and programs. We are the global leader in funding, producing, and synthesizing high-quality evidence of what works, for whom, why, and at what cost. We believe that high-quality and policy-relevant evidence will make development more effective and improve people's lives. So just by way of introduction, my name is Shannon Shisler. I'm delighted to chair this panel today. I'm a senior evaluation specialist with 3IE, and I was the technical lead for the quantitative analysis of the systematic review that will be presented today. Before we begin, I just want to give you a few notes on housekeeping. So first, if you wish to ask a question during today's panel, please use the Q&A box and not the chat function. When you send in a question, please include the name of the panelist that you would like a response from. If our event today is disrupted for any reason, we will shut the link down and we will reach out to you via email. This event is being live streamed on YouTube and shared on social media. If you are joining our event via live stream, please leave your questions in the comment box. We also encourage you to tweet any questions or points of view on Twitter. Please tag at 3IE News while you tweet and use hashtag WWGS2020. Before I introduce our panelists today, I just want to say a few words about the motivation for bringing this panel together in the first place. In this session, we will present and discuss the key findings and implications from a recent systematic review of efforts to build intergroup social cohesion in fragile contexts. Nearly a quarter of people in the world live in fragile contexts. In addition to being at greater risk of violence and psychological distress, they lag behind global averages on a range of socioeconomic outcomes. As conflict and fragility continues to rise, Many development agencies, including the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, or BMZ, have identified supporting fragile states as a key priority. In 2016, BMZ initiated the 6-year Transitional Development Assistance Project, or TDA, with the German Development Agency GIZ to provide assistance for people in crises, disasters, and conflicts, and enhance the resilience of people and institutions. To better inform their work to build sustainable peace throughout the TDA, GIZ commissioned 3IE to conduct a systematic review of intergroup social cohesion initiatives made possible through generous funding from BMZ. This session will first present the findings from the review, after which we will hear from panelists who can contextualize these findings and their implications for policymaking, research, and implementation. This conversation is timely in the context of our global pandemic and ongoing concerns around climate change. As threats to multidimensional human security intensify, it could increase the risk that tensions across social cleavages may escalate into violence. This means that understanding how we can build resilient social cohesion, particularly resilient bridging ties across social groups, is more important than ever. That being said, it's my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed panelists for today's webinar. I will only introduce them briefly, but you can find their full bios on the 3IE website, and the link to this page will be pasted into the chat box. So first we have Alexander Corlath, a specialist with the German Organization for International Cooperation, GIZ, where he advises in the application of behavioral insights for the sector program TDA, with a focus on peace, inclusive societies, and social cohesion. Next, I'd like to introduce Patricia Justino. Professor Justino is a development economist who works at the interface between development economics and political science. She is a leading expert on political violence and development, and the co-founder and co-director of the Households in Conflict Network, as well as a senior research fellow at UNU-WIDER. Our next panel member, Todd Gang, is the National Program Manager at Search for Common Ground Nigeria. He is a peace-building specialist who has spent the last 10 years reaching out to marginalized and conflict-affected communities across Nigeria with interventions that promote inclusiveness and fairness in protracted crises. Finally, Ada Sonnenfeld is an evaluation specialist at 3IE, where she leads evidence synthesis projects, including systematic reviews and evidence gap maps, specializing in the fields of governance, peace building, and rural development. So we will begin our panel today with Ada, who will kick us off by sharing the findings of the systematic review. Over to you, Ada.
Great, thank you so much, Shannon. So thank you, everybody. I'm really happy to be able to share the findings of this systematic review that we undertook with the support from BMZ and GIZ. Just a little bit of background about the review. I think Shannon gave a really excellent overview of the context in which this review was undertaken and the sort of policy rationale for it. I think the theory of change that underwrit at a very, very high level why we thought looking at interventions that build intergroup social cohesion in fragile contexts was quite important is this one listed across the bottom, which is that fundamentally we know we need to get better at building sustainable peace. The average duration of a crisis now lasts over 9 years, and fragility has very well documented long-term consequences for people's mental health, for their well-being, for economic outcomes, health, education, etc. There's research that suggests that countries with higher levels of social cohesion are associated with longer periods of sustained peace. As a result, many interventions have been implemented to try and build resilient social cohesion, particularly across social groups in fragile contexts. So a systematic review helps us understand what works for whom and under what conditions. This review specifically grew out of an evidence gap map that 3IE worked on in partnership with the German Institute for Development Evaluation, DEVEL, which was also funded by BMZ. And the evidence gap map identified a cluster of different types of approaches that aimed to build social cohesion. So we then decided to put together a systematic review to try and understand what works and which approaches are more effective for which populations. So a systematic review aims to identify, appraise, and synthesize evidence on the effects of interventions. And our primary research questions were looking at the effects on social cohesion outcomes in fragile communities. And we also looked at what factors relating to program design, implementation, context, and mechanism are associated with better or worse outcomes. Before I dive into the findings of the review a bit more broadly, I just wanted to take a moment to outline why we were undertaking a systematic review as the methodology for asking this question. A systematic review helps you synthesize and appraise the best available evidence for a particular question. We're specifically looking here at an effectiveness review, which aims to identify all of the evidence measuring the effects of a particular intervention on outcomes of interest. So to undertake this, we do an exhaustive search, then we systematically screen all of our search results against a set of predefined inclusion criteria, which help prevent us from cherry picking the evidence that fits our preconceived expectations of what we want to find. So systematic reviews facilitate access to the evidence by making it so that you don't have to read the hundreds and hundreds of papers that we read to get here, because we've done that and we've synthesized the findings. They also enable better decision-making and enable evidence-informed decision-making so that you can understand what rigorous evidence has identified about different types of interventions. Systematic reviews at 3IE are theory-driven, which means in addition to looking at effects, we also try to understand how the effects happen and what factors are associated with better or worse outcomes, and which populations and contexts the interventions may be more or less effective. The conceptual scope for this systematic review is the subset of horizontal cohesion that relates to bridging social ties, which we refer to as intergroup cohesion. So you can see through this sort of flow diagram, there's sort of the universe of social cohesion, which incorporates both horizontal cohesion, which relates to relationships between individuals and groups within a civil society, and vertical cohesion, which relates to the relationships between state institutions and society. We specifically focused on the horizontal sphere of social cohesion for this project. Within that, we further honed our focus to look at bridging social ties across groups. There's also bonding ties and intra-group relationships that also contribute to wider context and dimension of social cohesion. So we're focused specifically on what types of programs aim to promote resilient intergroup relationships in fragile contexts. Within this, we've identified 5 different dimensions of social cohesion, which are trust, a sense of belonging, a willingness to participate, a willingness to help, and an acceptance of diversity. This definition of social cohesion draws on the one developed by Chan et al. In 2006, as well as more recent work from the World Bank and Mercy Corps through Kim et al. 2020, in order to highlight the importance of acceptance of diversity, particularly for social cohesion in fragile contexts. The majority of studies that we identified were carried out in sub-Saharan Africa. We found 4 impact evaluations that were undertaken in Nigeria and 3 in Rwanda, and then a smattering of a number of other countries across sub-Saharan Africa. We found 2 studies from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and then only 1 study from East Asia and in the Philippines. Our findings from the pool of interventions that we identified that aim to build intergroup social cohesion, we broke them down according to the core components that they utilized in order to achieve these aims. And from there, we built them out into 5 different intervention categories, which you see on the screen. So the first category is school-based peace education. These interventions they worked with children and adolescents in schools through the education system, and they aimed to help students kind of trigger mechanisms of seeing the other, wherein they would understand and build the socio and emotional skills needed to recognize the negative effects of bias and the importance of recognizing people's humanity and the similarities that we have even across differences. The next set of interventions is around collaborative contact. These interventions aimed to enable groups to come together through an often more informal and more fun activity, such as a soccer league, or through something such as vocational education, which may not relate directly to building intergroup cohesion, but provided an opportunity for individuals from different groups to work together in a collaborative way and thereby build relationships with each other through mechanisms of working with the other that would ultimately aim to build intergroup social cohesion. The third intervention category is intergroup dialogues. These interventions brought people from different groups together, and they, rather than having them work on something not related to their differences, they specifically had them engage in guided conversations about the challenges and the similarities, and in many cases work through specific tensions across the groups that were related to the different communities. The fourth intervention category was the most complex, and these intervention categories incorporated elements of peace education that were typically delivered through workshops targeting adult populations, which provided a platform then through which to enable intergroup contact by bringing members of the different groups together. And then they also included an element of economic support, which again was serving more as a catalyst for enabling intergroup interactions rather than being included as a component aiming to achieve economic outcomes. So the focus was very much still on building intergroup relationships and using, for example, small scale community-driven development style projects where individuals from different groups would come together and select a project that would benefit both of their communities and then work on implementing that in partnership. So this group of interventions tended to be larger in scale and scope than many of the other studies within our review. They lasted usually between 3 to 5 years. And they also included some very, very large scale national programs, as well as some more smaller, more targeted programs. But compared to the others, they tended to be quite a bit larger in scope. The final group are Media for Peace interventions. And within this, we identified 2 different approaches. One was a set of edutainment programs, which were in our sample were radio dramas that were implemented and aimed to enable people to see the other through hearing about their stories and through creating characters with which people could identify and thereby recognize their shared humanity and see how we have some similarities, and sort of build sympathetic fictional characters that represented different groups so that people could find themselves relating to people even from other social groups. The other type of media study that we identified was a media campaign that aimed to promote counter narratives for countering violent extremism. So this took a different approach. Rather than aiming to kind of trigger an emotional response and create a shared sense of norms, it was more about countering narratives. And there's one study that we identified within this category that took place in Mozambique. So this just gives you a background and sort of a basis of these are the studies that we've included in this review. You can see the citations on the right of the screen. And I'm happy to share the particular citations if anybody wants more information about a specific study. So then what did we find? From these studies, we categorized all of the outcomes that they reported according to whether they were reporting an outcome of social cohesion or a different outcome. Within the social cohesion outcomes, we then separated them into whether they related to one of the 5 dimensions, or in some cases, studies would report an index that comprised measures of multiple indicators across different dimensions. And we then calculated the effect sizes for each outcome. What this means is that even though the different studies undertook their evaluations using different methodologies with different sample sizes, asking different questions, we are able to compare the findings because we have transformed them into a standardized effect size that lets us see what the relative difference is across all of these different studies. So what this figure shows you is within each of the blue squares, you can see all of the findings for a particular study, for a particular intervention group on that outcome. So for example, school-based peace education, there were 3 studies that reported outcomes of trust. And the color of the circle represents the direction of the effect. The green circles were those in which the effect, including its confidence interval, was in a positive direction, as in it represents an improvement in trust. Red represents a decrease in the trust between groups. And the gray circles are those where you can see through the sign which direction the effect was in, but then we can't be 95% confident that the true effect was not 0. So we have less confidence in those effects. So that, and then the size of the bubble relates to how large the effect was identified. So this helps you understand what you're looking at within this chart. And what you can see overall is a pattern of typically positive but small effects. Where we had at least 3 studies reporting comparable outcomes, we were able to conduct meta-analyses. And you can see here overlaid the effects, the findings for the different meta-analyses. What you see is that we found collaborative contact interventions have a positive impact on willingness to participate outcomes, and a small but statistically insignificant effect on acceptance of diversity. Workshops, Contact Econ, and Media for Peace programs both had positive effects on trust, while Media for Peace interventions had positive but insignificant effects on acceptance of diversity, and the Workshops, Contact Econ had similar small and insignificant effects on a sense of belonging and a willingness to participate. You can see in the intergroup dialogue row that we found effects in a negative direction for 2 meta-analyses here. However, these effects were driven by a study with one of the highest risks of bias within our review. And as a result, we don't have very much confidence in these findings. So I would caution against setting much store for these programs. These meta-analyses don't tell the whole story though. For example, the school-based peace education interventions, many of them had some of the strongest and most positive effects within the review. However, in no situation did we have at least 3 studies that were reporting comparable effects. So even, for example, in trust, where you can see 3 studies reported outcomes of trust, the study in the bottom right corner of the box actually measured the effects of trust on the parents of the children who participated in the program. So the parents didn't actually engage in any of the peace education interventions. So in this case, the study is reporting the indirect effects. The studies that reported direct effects on the children and adolescents who participated in the programs typically found positive effects. So what that suggests here is that these studies may have effects only on those who actually participate in the program, and particularly the smaller scale studies may not be able to achieve effects on indirect participants more broadly. They may not be sufficiently intensive. Another finding that I would like to draw your attention to is in the Media for Peace finding around acceptance for diversity. The insignificance of the meta-analysis was driven by a single study that took place in the Democratic Republic of Congo, whereas the other 2 studies reporting effects of radio dramas took place in Rwanda and Burundi. And in these 2 contexts, the context in which the radio drama was implemented was one of latent conflict, as in the relationships between the groups had a history of violence, but they were currently not in a really terrible place. They were still fragile, but the opportunity was seen as, there was more opportunity seen for building stronger relationships. Whereas in the DRC, the program was implemented at a time of worsening conflict. And it was really interesting because the programs in these situations were all extremely similar. All 3 were evaluating the effects of radio dramas implemented by the institution Radio La Benevolencia. So they had very similar approaches, and yet the findings were very different. And if you drop the DRC study from the meta-analysis, the findings on acceptance of diversity actually become very positive and significant, which suggests that in context of latent conflict, media for peace interventions may be able to improve effects on acceptance of diversity. I would like to also highlight, however, that there are negative effects within this review. And this is important because it suggests that there is the possibility for these studies to actually have negative outcomes on participants. For example, in the school-based peace education row, you can see in the bottom right corner, I mentioned the study was measuring indirect effects, and their interpretation of these negative findings was that they likely were not related to the intervention itself. However, one of the studies measuring effects on the children who participated in the bottom left corner, you can see had a very positive effect on trust, but a negative effect on a sense of belonging. And this study also identified negative effects on students' sense of confidence and self-efficacy, particularly among girls. And qualitative analysis within the research suggested that this might be because the project enabled the students to understand the negative consequences of bias and discrimination, but it was not sufficient in intensity and in duration to get them towards a place where they felt able to do something about it. And as a result, some of the students ended up feeling somewhat alienated from a sense of feeling at home in their country. And like I said, also on negative impact on their sense of confidence and self-efficacy. The one study within the intergroup dialogues row that had the most positive effects on willingness to participate and willingness to help, which you can see in the top left corner, excuse me, which also found a positive effect on trust. This was a study of a reconciliation program that took place in Sierra Leone. And while this study identified positive effects on intergroup social cohesion, it identified negative effects on the mental health of victims from the conflict who participated in the program. And so this again raises the risk that such types of interventions do have the potential to have harmful effects for participants. And so there is a need to think about the balance between positive group level outcomes and possibly negative individual level outcomes. So there's a lot of information here, but these are just some of the stories that I wanted to tell you from the findings of this review from the quantitative side. As I mentioned, we also looked at what factors might be explaining these effects. How can we better interpret these effects to understand, what they mean, where do they relate to, etc. So in order to do this, we compared the findings from the quantitative analysis to the contextual factors for each of the interventions included, as well as any descriptive and qualitative information that we could identify about the specific programs. And from that, we identified a few different trends that seem to be related and as possible to the, that seem to be associated, with greater or worse effects on outcomes. The first is that we found a few instances in which interventions reported challenges in identifying the adequate or appropriate local bottleneck to intergroup social cohesion. So there are a few cases in which the study found either limited or mixed effects, and the author's interpretation of these effects was that actually the bottleneck to intergroup social cohesion that the program was addressing was maybe not really the right one for the population that was targeted. For such a type of program, you are often, we can't force anybody to participate. And because of that, the people who are inclined to participate in programs that are explicitly about bringing people together and discussing things across social cleavages may be already inclined to feel a higher sense of trust or sense of belonging or willingness to. And what that means is there's a need to make sure then that what you're measuring and the way that you're comparing the potential of the intervention to work with such a participant group is aligned with where they can get to. So it doesn't mean that that there's no value in working with people who are motivated to do this kind of work. There's a real need for such champions of intergroup cohesion in fragile contexts. However, when it comes to how you evaluate that, you need to keep in mind what their starting point is. Another potential barrier that we identified was a lack of conflict assessments. I think conflict assessments are quite often utilized within the peacebuilding field, but within this subset of studies for which we found rigorous impact evaluations, only one of them reported basing its study design, its intervention design on a conflict assessment. And what conflict assessments can do is they can help identify who the key actors are within a community that might make it easier to target the people who are really capable of bringing the communities together to make sure that we aren't just preaching to the choir in these situations. Another factor that we identified that might explain some of the effects is that social cohesion interventions alone simply may not be sufficient for improving sustainable social cohesion without structural changes that address underlying threats to human security and well-being outcomes. What we mean by this is that the drivers of tensions across social groups are not simply related to people's prejudices and the historical tensions between the groups. There are many other factors that influence not only how an individual feels about somebody from a different group, but also how they may act on those feelings. And these interventions, while they do seem to be able to have small effects, may not be sufficient on their own for sustainable social cohesion in the long run without complementary interventions that address the threats to human security that may be exacerbating the tensions. Sort of on a related note, smaller scale interventions may not provide sufficient intensity of treatment to have effects beyond direct participants. I gave the example earlier of the school-based peace education study that measured indirect effects on parents. And we found at least one other example where a smaller scale intervention measured indirect effects on community members who did not participate and also found limited results. So that means that in order to have effects on indirect participants, I think across social science research, it's recognized that the intensity of the intervention and the scale has to be quite a bit larger. Another potential barrier is of long and nonlinear causal changes. We mentioned the example of the case where students had reported actually feeling less confident and a worse sense of belonging following the intervention. And what this might mean is that the causal chain here may not be linear. There may be a need to step backwards to recognize the negative consequences of prejudice and intergroup tensions before we can then help people take 2 steps forward and address those. But if the interventions are not given sufficient time to work with people to move them all along that pathway, then we risk, sort of leaving the job half done almost. Finally, we also identified very few studies that measured intermediate outcomes along the chain. So particularly for shorter term interventions, maybe it isn't realistic to expect to see an effect on intergroup social cohesion, but maybe there are some more intermediate, more immediate outcomes that we might be able to identify. And maybe those might help us understand whether we're on the right path. But very few studies measured such outcomes. And in one of the cases where it did, they were able to identify that there were no effects on the intermediate outcome. And this they took to explain the lack of findings on the social cohesion outcome. So to explain that case, the study in this situation was one of vocational training programs. So it was one of these collaborative contact interventions that brought people together into a classroom situation where they worked very closely with members of the other group on the various classroom activities. However, the first step in the theory of change for that intervention was that participants would report getting to know members of the other group better. And this intermediate outcome, that through the classroom activities, people were not only working together on the projects, but also getting to know each other, they actually found no effects on that outcome. And so that seemed to explain why they also found no effects further down the line on other outcomes of social cohesion. So this shows the importance of measuring intermediate outcomes, because they can sometimes help you understand why you may or may not be seeing effects further down the line. So what does this mean? What are the implications? I think I've touched on a few of these in the previous slide as well. But on their own, kind of overall, social cohesion interventions are able to have positive effects. However, alone they may be insufficient for building resilient social cohesion. One way to think about it is that they're just one piece of the puzzle that is required for building sustainable peace. In order to really understand how these different puzzle pieces fit together, though, there's more theory building work that's required to understand how programs that, for example, do try to target human security outcomes and do try to implement structural changes that address systemic inequalities across groups can interact with programs that target social cohesion kind of from the softer scale in terms of intergroup relationships. Another implication is that all 5 dimensions of social cohesion are important to measure. One of the limitations of the study was that there weren't actually that many instances where we were able to run meta-analyses due to the wide variety of outcomes that were reported in the different studies. And so there were actually not that many situations where we could find 3 comparable outcomes to measure. In terms of one way to address that, I think we found that there's a huge importance of particularly for acceptance of diversity, of local context and making sure that indicators are locally relevant. So what that means is that there's a need for a common framework at a kind of middle range theory level onto which locally relevant indicators can be mapped. And so this fits in with this idea that there's a lot more theory building work required within social cohesion to get us towards a place where we can kind of as a field identify common middle range theories for how we might be able to build intergroup social cohesion, but that which nonetheless allow for sufficient flexibility so that the indicators that we measure in order to understand each of the different steps within that middle range theory are highly relevant to local contexts. Finally, the last outcome the last implication that I'd like to mention is that very few of the studies actually reported having received ethical approval for their research. And this is concerning because, especially as the review has found that these interventions do have the possibility of doing harm for participants, getting ethical approval is very important to ensure that both the research and the interventions themselves do no harm. So those are the overview of the findings. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon to start leading the rest of the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Ada, for your wonderful presentation of those findings. At this time, we're going to open it up to the panel to join the discussion. We're going to ask the panel members to speak for about 10 minutes apiece to contextualize the findings within their own work. And then for the last about 20 minutes or so, we're going to open it up to questions. So please do send your questions in. And at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Alexander.
All right. Well, thank you for the presentation and thank you for the invitation and that I could say some things today. Towards myself, a bit information towards the transitional development assistance I'm working in. I had the luck to actually work the last month on this report and really analyze it piece by piece to figure out the findings you can actually use in practice and what to understand better what the value actually is by the findings of this report. Let me tell you a bit about transitional development assistance. Well, eventually, projects regarding this try to increase resilience of vulnerable populations in fragile contexts in different sectors like food security, disaster risk management, basic service infrastructure, and peace and inclusive societies. So Since TDA operates, Transitional Development Assistance operates in such crisis settings, it is most often the case that the conflict background is between intergroups, different groups like ethnicities, different religions, or host populations and refugees. So it shows us a special importance how this intergroup social cohesion is actually addressed. And TDA also tries to balance between more, how should I say, feasible projects like the construction of buildings and also the change of behavior, which is less feasible and more difficult. Because just in combination, interventions like these can have effects on complicated peace processes. So this shows us how important evidence actually is. And the evidence we have here is something we can really rely on. And let me tell you later about the sizes, because I saw a question in the commentary. I want to address that. So as we can see, peace work is a complex process of social transformation. And like Ada already mentioned, it is seldomly really linear process, but it means they have different layers of it, and sometimes it's difficult to predict how an intervention will influence the development or the peace process of a country or region. So regarding to the findings, I see several aspects actually which are very useful for the practice of the transitional development assistance. The most tangible results for policymakers and evaluators is very apparent, simply because it gives us an idea where social cohesion actually aims to increase peace or resilience by giving us this construct of intergroup social cohesion. And it stresses like a different approach regards to vertical social cohesion or the bonding and the intergroup social cohesion. So we often see project proposals, be it from national donors or from NGOs or even from the UN, that social cohesion, the word is, you could say it's used inflationary, and it is often an objective, defined as an objective, but you can't see often that it differentiates between the levels the social cohesion needs to be improved. So we have already something here we can orientate ourselves. It's a very basic gift from the study, you could say. And secondly, it also shows us how an effect of interventions can be measured by having these 5 dimensions. We could see before these 5 dimensions gives us enough flexibility to measure social cohesion for very specific context, while still being able to aggregate data for whole regions for political communication. So this is actually something which didn't happen often, because social cohesion isn't something you can find often in evaluation measures for the individual level, which is so important. So thirdly, and I think most importantly, it shows us also what a conflict and context analysis, what you could see in implications, needs to make visible. So we have like this individual level, in my opinion, the most difficult level to actually measure, because when we're talking about this level, we're talking about social norms, we're talking about attitudes, even about emotions and motivations of people. So this is actually the level on which peace processes develop, where they can be made relevant. So this is just 3 ways in which the report gives the policymakers orientation. The results in specific I also find very interesting, because we can see that that's direct, like Ada already mentioned, social cohesion interventions can just be one part of a bigger puzzle. So this is nothing new. Later, since the recent Nobel Prize winner, we know that other aspects besides interventions of social cohesion are very important for long-term peace process and social cohesion process, such as nutrition security, food security, as those levels and those measures are necessary elements for building peace. The report shows us exactly that interventions for social cohesions are just can maybe by itself show what we would say small effect, but if you consider it in combination with other projects, with other interventions on different layers, they become much bigger And this is something very valuable, that we still have these small effects, I would say. So if you combine them, depending on context, with livelihood support, with job creation, or MHPSS, intervention that all have an effect on social cohesion, you could even call it another hard evidence on the HDP nexus. And why multi-sectoral, multi-level programming and development cooperation and peace building is so important. So this is these are the specific results we will take. Additionally, very interesting in the report is, maybe that's also my perspective because I'm a trained psychologist, it is interesting to identify aspects of behavioral insights like social behavior change communication, and how methods like these are actually important to identify, also in the frame of a conflict on context analysis, how these behavioral bottlenecks can be found, and how specific interventions can address such bottlenecks. For example, like Ada said, when the parents cannot be reached by intervention of the children, how conflict analysis can show us blind spots to address those issues. So this is something from an individual level, which is also very important for me personally. It also shows us how to better identify the do no harm in a specific context, and how to avoid actually doing damage to the target populations, which has to be prevented by any way. And also how an interconnection with other measures like MHPSS, mental health, psychological support has an impact. Finally, it also shows us very concrete possibilities for impact measurement. And like I said before, if you already have a framework you can orientate, and you have a conflict analysis that identifies where the social cohesion actually aims to, if in a specific context, vertical social cohesion is important, or intergroup social cohesion is important, and in this specific context, trust or sense of belonging or willingness to participate, depending on what the necessities are, it shows us possibilities how to measure impact better and long term. So this is something we took out of this report, and we will definitely try to include it in the be it counseling, advising, and definition of monitoring systems. These are like the five points I would like to show. So that's from my side. I hope I could answer also the question I saw, that the small findings, the magnitude of effects, actually, it might be small on first sight, but if you consider it within the framework of other measures, within a bigger framework, they are actually much stronger and they have a bigger magnitude. So I want to point this out very specifically. Thank you.
Very much appreciated. Thank you so much for your comments. So next we're going to ask Patricia. It looks like she's sharing some slides with us. So whenever you're ready, thank you.
Sorry, just trying to make it into full screen. It's not quite working, so I'll just carry on anyway. Okay, let me see if I can just... Okay, can you all see the screen then? Yeah, okay, sorry. Thank you very much, Ada, for the invitation to be here. And I wanted to actually address a bit some of the theoretical underlyings of what goes into these interventions around social cohesion, and then provide some more thoughts about ways forward, which is how you sort of finish your presentation. I read the report with a lot of interest, but I've also been working in this field for a very long time. And there are two things that always strikes me in this sort of what's called social cohesion interventions. The first is with the fact that some aspects of it are not quite taken in considerations. So there are when we think about social cohesion, and the concept itself is not very well defined, as we've discussed this before when the report was sort of starting, and some of this kind of language still borrows a bit from social capital as well, etc. But when we think about social cohesion, we generally have in mind issues around trust and around social cooperation and all series of other outcomes that are related to that. And that's absolutely fine. And a lot of interventions address precisely that, this issue about social cooperation and trust between groups. However, one area that usually is missed is the fact that you can change social cooperation and you can change trust, but actual social change is not going to happen if you don't also address the ability of groups to coordinate collective action that will drive that change. And this issue of coordination is often missing from a lot of these sort of policy interventions. And I mean, I'm taking a very swift sort of view on this, but social interventions generally are around around building social and emotional skills, improve social interpersonal relations, and increase both the quantity and the quality of intergroup contact. That's more or less what all of these aims at doing. But then, as Ada herself made the point really well, is this ignores the sort of contextual settings. And in these, there are two areas that I think are quite important. First is the issue of inequalities and how they experience within groups and between groups, and the whole sort of economic and social context around these. And the other is to do with the power exercised by different group members, elites. And I'll come back to this in a minute to talk a bit more about this. But going back to the issue of social cooperation and coordination and the tensions that arise between the two, I wanted just to show you, I won't have a lot of time to go into this, but this is some work I did for the joint UN and World Bank report on pathways to peace. And in there, we discuss precisely this kind of issues. So if you look at the first line, and most interventions do tend to sort of improve cooperation and reduce antagonism between the groups. That's basically at the core of what's being done. You will sort of achieve positive results only if group coordination is high. So groups are capable of getting together for peaceful collective action. If that does not happen, then we sort of have a fragmentation of social relations at various ends. If the intervention by some whatever reason fails and you actually increase antagonism between groups, which can happen, and there are a couple of examples in the report that happened, then you actually have a much higher probability of violence and returning back to conflict, say, if coordination is high, whereas you end up in this situation of fragmented social relations, again, if coordination is low. So all these issues actually are quite important. And they kind of also are part of what sometimes I think is kind of a misunderstanding of all this social cohesion literature, is we always think about social cohesion as being a good thing. And generally, it's a good thing. We try to improve. It's a good social good. But actually, we sometimes tend to forget that high levels of trust and social cooperation are actually quite necessary for conflicts and violent conflict to take place in the first place. And also requires high levels of coordination between groups as well, or within groups. So in some cases, this trust and social cooperation has been shown to actually facilitate violent conflict. So you have, this kind of begs the question, what kind of social cohesion are we looking for? What does it look like? And these things are generally not very well addressed. Finally, we also have the issue of social cohesion fundamentally is indulgence, as what we economists call an indulgence to conflict. And when you try to change social cooperation and social trust and other forms of social cohesion, you have to take in consideration that actually conflict itself and other forms of fragility may change these variables themselves in different ways. Sometimes we see a reinforcement of parochial attitudes towards outgroups, and that is quite common. But we also, there's plenty of research out there that shows now that sometimes conflict leads to more involvement in collective action in the post-conflict and to better forms of social cohesion. So I feel this is not really being taken in consideration. And this endogeneity really complicates how these interventions are designed. And also complicates when they should be implemented. Because not only it's important to understand exactly what concepts we're trying to address and what kind of sort of social phenomenon we're trying to address, but it's also important to understand when and how social cooperation can change, both in the immediate term. So we have, let's say we're thinking about conflict-affected countries. Do we do it in the immediate time? I guess a lot of interventions come in trying to improve the situation, but then what works in the immediate term may not work in the long term, or may look completely different depending on how things progress. So these dynamics are important, and of course, I think we're still the very, very early days in all this in this field, which sort of is pretty evident by the number of studies that was part of the report. It's pretty small compared to many other areas in conflict analysis where you have much more evidence. So this is very early days. And in terms of the dynamics, I think it's also important to think, what are we doing with this? Are we trying to prevent violence and trying to mitigate it? Are we trying to prevent a reoccurrence? What is it? And all these may look completely different. And this finally brings me to my final point, which is about groups are not homogeneous units, and there are a lot of happens between groups. And I think in every single of the papers that became part of the report, the groups are defined in very, very different ways, right? Which makes it really impossible to compare. And we have, it's important to look at social cohesion, or I like to focus on the sort of trust and social cooperation aspects between the citizens, between the groups, but also there is an element of vertical social cohesion in a way between citizens and elites within groups. And this could really, really lead to completely different conclusions, depending. And also then there's the other complication that those things, the vertical and the horizontal aspects, interact. And they can interact in very different ways. I just wanted to give you an example of some work we're doing now on social trust. It's not on fragile countries. It's a global survey that we've been trying to track changes in trust since COVID-19 started in a global survey called Life with Corona survey. We have now about 16,000 respondents in that survey. And just to show you, we ask questions of what we can call sort of horizontal social cohesion, so trust in other people. And these are the countries for which at the moment we have sort of better data. And we see a variety of things. In Spain, trust between people has gone down since the start of COVID-19. It's gone up in the US, in the UK, in Portugal, quite high numbers. But then we also ask trust in government, where government is being taken in these cases, sort of elite versus citizen, the vertical aspect of it. And we see trust in governments decreasing dramatically in the same period of time. So these things move in completely different directions and will have different effects depending on what it is, because fundamentally social cohesion is a mechanism to achieve something else. In the case that we're talking about, most likely, reduction of violence or the prevention of riots recurrence. In the case of COVID, we're thinking about, improving, making sure the infections go down and so forth. So I thought I would just bring those kind of more theoretical discussions to the table. But I really enjoyed reading the report, and I think it's really good to see something on social cohesion out there, which sort of brings together the most rigorous analysis. So thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
Patricia, thank you so much for sharing. It's especially interesting to see your findings on COVID. So we appreciate you bringing those to the panel today. And so last but not least, we would love to invite Tog to give us some comments.
Right, yeah, thank you so much. I think I would start with a comment that Ada made about the average length of crisis globally, like 9 years. It's unfortunate that most of our programming is like half or less of that. So that's a gap to even begin with. I work with Search for Common Ground, and we've been working in Nigeria since 2014, basically to work with local communities on how they respond or transform conflict. So these are just basically my experiences working out there in the field. I can relate to a lot of these findings on a day-to-day basis. It's sad first to see Nigeria features very prominently when we talk of crisis and fragility and conflict. However, I think we have a responsibility as practitioners to also provide additional data beyond just these reports. And it also depends on how we transit or we exit from these communities to see how they are doing beyond the life of these projects. I think there's several examples that we can still focus on that could provide more flesh to this current data that we have right in front of us. So that's important. And I think a responsibility from us development agencies or practitioners is to also find a way to attribute these numbers to our specific interventions or programs. I think one of the challenges we face as development practitioners is that we tend to concentrate in the same spaces, either out of convenience, and the intentions are good, but it also undermines our ability to demonstrate impact for the programs that we implement on a day-to-day. Just like Ada mentioned, social cohesion cannot function on its own. It requires an integration of development programs that address these structural issues, but most importantly, what is the policy environment that we are working under? It's very important that we involve all the stakeholders in order to get the results which we yearn to see. I think from my own experiences, I've seen the value of working not just to build the capacities of our policymakers just from trainings, but also sharing this information that we get from conflict assessments or context analysis, and allowing them to feed into it so that they can be able to refine these policies or frameworks that will allow us to function in our local communities as well. Because these context analysis do provide some of the solutions towards addressing some of these structural issues or drivers of conflict. We also need to understand, even as we talk about social cohesion, a lot of the barriers to social cohesion are beyond the control of just the communities themselves. We also need to factor in what their capacities are on their level and what we require other people that we might be indirect beneficiaries from our programs, what we require from them as well. We've seen this over and over again through our implementation that we come in with these projects, which Ada mentioned, the 5 different types of projects, without even considering what reconciliation or truth commissions can provide to these kinds of contexts as well. So that's very important that we consider how do the people heal before we even come in with these interventions, considering the scope or the geographical spread which most of these programs are implemented. Particularly in Nigeria, it's despite the situation we find ourselves in, Nigeria is actually a rich country with a lot of resources. So it's very important that beyond these resources, we're also building capacities for the people on the ground to be able to measure these programs on their own. So that also entails even distribution of monies or resources towards impact evaluations such as this. I think we all fall victim to this, where we dedicate little to nothing towards demonstrating evidence and impact for our projects, even from a development perspective, how much more so of our governments, which we require their support or expertise to support our efforts as well. I think this theory where we talk about when we get community leaders to come together on a project, it will benefit the entire community. That might not necessarily be so. For some reasons, it could be where the power dynamics or the level of influence varies between the us and them, which we see across several conflicts or issues in Nigeria. So what we do, or some of the challenges we face with that when we bring these contact theory into practice, is that we further exacerbate the tensions or those grievances between these different people or conflict actors. Well, the one party with more relevance or influence will be looking more towards increasing their influence and domination. One of the other parties will be more interested around systemic change. And that could be a big hindrance towards these numbers that we are seeing today, or from this research that has been presented to us. It's sad that we don't have enough evidence at this point in time to really show the contributions of social cohesion, or much more like we would have expected to see. But looking at Nigeria's situation today, you just need to look back at the how cohesive communities are around economics and political action to know what is possible when communities work together. Nigeria is going through a very difficult time politically around some of these structural changes that we want to see. So maybe there are lessons that we can take from bringing communities together towards joint action, maybe towards peace or social cohesion as a whole. We do need to also understand that cultural barriers to also exist in a lot of these contexts that we're working in. Several of these projects, from reading this research, we do understand that there were small populations that we spoke to, understanding that necessarily so working with these small populations does not necessarily trickle down to the entire community. This could be for cultural regions, as I mentioned, or even for financial gains in some instances where communities feel as if they are, when these projects come to them, it comes for their individual interest as against the community benefits as a whole. So therefore, we need to be intentional about how we are measuring social cohesion as a whole, not just as an afterthought, which we tend to see a lot in programming or implementation, particularly here in Nigeria as well. I think somebody did mention about the numbers behind that was presented. I think they might look in some people's eyes insignificant. I do know that donors are much more interested about the spread, dispersion of the program effects. But as an implementer, what I tend to do is to put a face behind the data that is presented. Understanding that there are a lot of people that we are making this change for. And I think we need to do a better job in how we document these stories to back up this data so that we can have a better understanding of what it really means. So we need to look beyond just the numbers and look at the story behind the data, which is very important. And I do know some of the presenters did talk about behaviors and attitudes. This varies in context and location as well. I have worked in some local communities where trust did improve within the local community, and in the community just a few kilometers away, that trust did not improve with the same conflict actors, same identity as well. So it's very important that even as we develop these programs as well, we should understand what the goals are from a behavioral point, and also what we expect from the programs from an attitudinal point as well. We need to understand what are programs, the emphasis they place on these two metrics, and work towards improving those numbers as well. I think a potential limitation for many social cohesion projects based on the contact theory and community-driven development is the expectation that that within such programs, that intense work with few people spreads to the larger community, which I mentioned a few earlier as well. So beyond the direct participants that we're working with, we need to make a conscious approach to also sample what is happening beyond the larger community as well, so that we can quickly reprogram and redirect our program for much more results or beneficial results. We fall victim to sympathy versus empathy game. So a lot of us working in this field, we understand that we are already part of the conflict, and it is also natural that our sentiments will play into how we support these communities as well. But we also need to understand that we have a collective responsibility to continue to share this kind of body of evidence for people even beyond our immediate programs or our immediate communities as well. One last point, which I would just like to mention, which is very important, is I think some of this data shows us that for Nigeria in particular, where I think 4 studies were conducted, we are actually implementing in areas where the contact in protracted crisis. And even as we implement in such situations, it could also undermine our best intentions as well. Some of the data that we present before even getting these grants or even implementing these in these areas focuses more around reactive approaches, as again, setting up those mechanisms for much more prevention towards our interventions as well. So it's very important that we understand the context and at the stage of what conflict we are actually providing these figures or numbers as well. I think I will just stop here at this moment. I think one recommendation I would give from this is that we need to explore mechanisms or a combination of mechanisms or approaches in dealing with issues of social cohesion. So things that deal with social norms, individual persuasion, and also vicarious contact between the people we want to work with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Todd. I really appreciate you guys mentioning the size of the impacts and sort of contextualizing that within as a smaller piece of the puzzle, and then also that even these small impacts are making positive impacts on people's lives. And so that's really a good point to focus on. And so I just want to thank the panel for some really thoughtful and thought-provoking comments. And we've been getting in some questions from our audience. And so at this time, I'd like to open the floor to some of those questions. So I'm just going to pull one of these here. So this question's from Andrew. And he'd like to know, where do you think we go from here? And this is not directed to anyone specifically. So whoever is interested in jumping in, what is the biggest priority for future impact evaluations? Do we need to deepen the findings for interventions in this review specifically, or should we move to other evidence gaps? And if we do move to other evidence gaps, then which gaps do you see as the most important?
Thanks for that. I might take a quick stab, but then I'd be really interested, Alex, in hearing your thoughts on this question.
Yes, as I mentioned before, I was addressing this question when I said that we cannot really take these small effect sizes as a final result, but we have to consider them within the context, within an intervention framework. This is one point. The other point I also want to stress out is that when we're talking about attitudes and behaviors and personal reports on an individual level, and it becomes especially interesting if you consider results of the peace education measures and the trust measures, the media for peace measures on trust, because if you have a normal project proposal, you usually aim to scale these measures up to reach a bigger population, especially if you consider reflecting on peace practice to reach many people as possible in a peace process. You usually can think that these results reach thousands of people within a conflict region, within a fragile context, if everything goes well. And if you have these effect sizes, then this means a lot regarding the behavior and the interactions of certain people. So that's why I want to stress out that this peace education results and the media for peace results on trust are especially interesting.
Thanks, Alex. I think, Patricia, I'd also be interested in hearing your thoughts on sort of where the research field should go next. I think my personal perception is that this should not be the last, this isn't the final word on social cohesion interventions. I think we identified many ways in which, as I mentioned, one of my implications that I think is really important from this is the need for more theory building work to identify common frameworks for understanding social cohesion and measuring it that are adaptable to local contexts, and also for, I've lost my train of thought. That's one of the main next steps, I think. But Patricia, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree. Actually, I actually see it as the first step towards much more work on this. I mean, the number of papers which you can rely on is very small, and so I see this field very much in its infancy. Although there is a huge literature out there in economics and political science, which might help define some of these concepts a bit better. And I think one of the pleas I would do is, please let's stop calling it social cohesion, because it's too much. It's just a huge concept with not much I mean, you end up doing too much without focusing on what you're trying to do. What's the difference? Because then what's the difference between social cohesion and social capital in the way it's kind of framed currently? And I think we might do better going step by step. I mean, some of the papers that look at trust, for instance, are pretty rigorous. Some of the papers that look on the, also, they call it differently, but talking about social cooperation, which is a very well-defined concept, also do it quite well. And it seems to be that some of the papers that do that are the ones that actually can go a bit further with some of these things. So yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that it's very helpful to have such a broad concept to do something that is so complicated and so difficult, which is basically about changing the face of an entire society, which is moving out of conflict. So yeah, that's my plea.
Dr., do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think just generally, just to add to what others have said as well, I think the research tells us just 24 where it made the final cut, and looking at the huge investment in dollar terms that have been put towards building much more cohesive communities, I think there's still a lot that needs to be done. Harmonizing these frameworks, it's very even within the peace building field, when you hear what people call the same thing in the sector, it's also confusing to us practitioners on the ground as well. I think we need to work better as development agencies and try to understand that no one takes the glory individually. At the end of the day, the glory belongs to the communities themselves. So we have a collective responsibility to also empower our communities to understand what peace means to them and take full ownership of that. I think that's a responsibility that we need to be better at as practitioners in the field.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for your comments. We have another question here. This is specifically related, Ada, to your presentation. Could you provide an example of the type of structural change which could or should be included with intergroup social cohesion interventions to address threats to human security? What are some of the factors that you were referring to when you mentioned that?
Thanks. That's a very good question. I think the main answer is that it will vary by context. As one of the things that we've mentioned is that the drivers of tensions and the drivers of conflict are complex and vary widely across contexts. And I think this speaks to the importance of conflict assessments so that you can understand what the locally relevant drivers are in a particular context. And it also speaks to the need to really make sure that all interventions are adapted to local needs and local bottlenecks. So when it comes to structural, but an example of what we mean when we're talking about this is, for example, many interventions in describing the context in which they were implemented noted structural inequalities between the two groups. In many situations, there was one group who was either more associated with political power or one group that was more associated with more of the economic power. And these differences in perceptions, which may or may not have necessarily been real at a kind of individual household level, often had very real effects on intergroup social cohesion. So for example, one of the programs in Jordan that we included in the review actually incorporated the economic component of the intervention, not to try and change the economic inequalities between the two groups, which it did recognize, but explicitly as a way of softening the perception of differences in economic or in access to infrastructure in this case particularly. So the context was one where many refugees were arriving in Jordan and communities felt that they were being overwhelmed and that this was having a negative effect on their access to services. And so, you know, one of the ways to address this partially could be through this kind of changing the perception of whether this is the case. But there was also a lot of discussion within that report about how there were real issues with service delivery within the Jordanian context for both the Jordanian and the refugee populations, and that there were issues that were related to governance and governance and stuff within the Jordanian context, that the refugees were sort of being used as the scapegoats, even though really fundamentally there was a need to fix or to strengthen access to services sort of more generally. So that's the kind of thing when we say structural changes that are really about shifting people's access to services and people's ability to participate in them. So it's just an example.
Thank you so much. Okay, so it looks like the next comment is related to Patricia's presentation. Someone said that they very much appreciate Patricia's zoom into the negative characteristics of the concept of social cohesion. I think the meaning of language and terms is crucial here. I have the impression that the factor of accepting diversity is sometimes just a tick the box, although it is most central to the concept. We should not forget that socially coherent societies were the objective of ethnic cleansing in the past. So, Patricia, I would just invite you to offer some commentary on Tobias's comment.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very good point, because there's plenty of literature out there from the Second World War and from modern civil wars, which show that social cooperation and homogeneity between groups were crucial to the onset of pretty violent conflicts. So that's where we get into what was Schilling, one Nobel Prize in Economics some time ago, called the dark side of social capital. And that's pretty much present still in many parts of the world. And I think we need to kind of bring that into consideration, because it also links to the point that like Alexander made, which is we have to make sure we understand the difference between change in behaviors and change in attitudes. And like I've run several of these behavioral experiments and so forth, and it's very easy to get results for changes in immediate attitudes. You know, people tell you what they want when they think you want to hear. But if you go and try to understand underlying behaviors, you probably see that they're much more difficult to change. And I think that's, and one of the reasons is precisely this sort of dark side of social capital that we sort of forget about it. So yeah, it's a very complex area. And I think this is very important to take into consideration. I appreciate the point about ticking boxes, because sometimes some of these things are done because it's assumed that, you know, social diversity and so forth is a good thing, but the unintended consequences are also important to take into consideration.
Thank you so much. Ada, did you have an additional comment on that?
Yeah, just sort of very quickly, I think one of the reasons that we chose to include acceptance of diversity within our definition of social cohesion was really for the exact reason that you've highlighted, which is that social cohesion as a concept, and this is something Patricia's noted as well, has a very broad background and has been used to refer to many, many different things. So we sort of took the almost moral opinion that when you talk about what social cohesion means, it doesn't just mean a society in which there's high levels of trust and willingness to participate within government that affect, you know, that only target one, even if it's a majority group within the population. So we sort of wanted to make sure that we were asking, well, social cohesion for whom? Who feels a sense of belonging? And So by including acceptance of diversity as a core domain within our definition of social cohesion, we wanted to highlight that you could not, so that we don't think you can suggest that communities or societies are socially cohesive where there are individuals who feel or who are systematically excluded. So that was just sort of a, approach that we took to defining the concept within the review.
Great point. Thank you so much. I'm thinking we might have time for one more. Yannick has said, in our work, social cohesion and social cohesion and resilience, we've often found that hardliners and others with the highest transformative potential aren't always the ones engaged in funded interventions. Instead, fence sitters and or those that are willing to participate in peace building activities, and so who might be considered less vulnerable, are often the focus of impact analyses. Do you have any recommendations on how to reach or consider those at the most extreme margins? And I'm going to ask Tog to comment on this one.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, actually. And I've seen this over and over again, where we, not even only the hardliners, where we see less and less of youth and women actually involved in these interventions. I think because for different reasons whatsoever, it could be timing or accessibility in many instances. So we tend to recycle the same actors. And that's why it's very difficult to see significant changes or results across these interventions as well. I think just like the point which this research has highlighted, we need to invest a lot in conflict assessments, stakeholder mappings, community resource mappings as well. And when we are done with it, we need to make reference to them. I have been on several projects where I see after conducting these assessments, we never refer to the findings for any reason whatsoever, which is a very, it's a living document which we need to constantly refer to and also engage other people to understand how their attitudes or their behaviors are also tipping the conflict dynamics within the communities they find themselves in. I've been opportune to have conflict analysis sessions with community leaders where they are actually monitoring the conflict trends within their communities, and they consciously will come out to try and change those numbers or those graphs in a much more favorable way. So, and the only way you can do this is to bring the problem or what is perceived as a problem into the room and not deal with it as an external issue as well. That's why it takes time as well. We do understand that peace building is a process, it takes time as well, and building cohesive societies also entails this kinds of patience and endurance in order to tip the scale or change the numbers as well.
Thank you so much. Ada, did you have a comment on this one as well?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Tog mentioned completely. And I think the other point to note is that, for example, there's one study that I mentioned that was the vocational training intervention, which I thought did a really good job of making very explicit attempts to engage people who would not willingly sign up for a program that was billed as some form of intergroup social cohesion initiative. So the study presented quite detailed contextual analysis to articulate why it was targeting the at-risk young men who it was targeting and in the ways that it was targeting them and bringing them together through this vocational training opportunity that they presented evidence as being very highly, very salient to the target communities. So I think that shows that there are ways of getting around this that have been attempted in the literature. Unfortunately, like I also mentioned, that study did identify a challenge in just reaching the first step of their theory of change in terms of getting people to know each other through their vocational training program. So it shows that there's still work to be done. But in terms of achieving that first step of targeting actors who may not be willing at, kind of face value or in first reaction to participate in a social cohesion intervention, that is possible. And there are creative ways to go about doing that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we're actually just about out of time today. Before we wrap up our session, I just want to thank all of the wonderful panelists for a really interesting and engaging conversation. The discussion today has shed light on the challenges, but also the opportunities and the potential for building intergroup social cohesion in fragile contexts. We know there's a lot more work to be done in support of these efforts, but it's really encouraging to see so many different actors grappling with these important issues in meaningful ways. The systematic review and the work highlighted by panelists are just some of the many ongoing efforts to understand and strengthen the effectiveness of interventions to build intergroup social cohesion. We look forward to future opportunities to bring the field together to continue this conversation. A brief that summarizes the findings of the systematic review is available on the 3IE website, and the link was shared in the chat earlier in the session. The full report will be published within the next few weeks. A big thank you to the audience and everyone who joined us today for this engaging panel discussion. The live stream of this video has been uploaded to 3IE's YouTube channel in case you would like to share or rewatch this webinar. If you'd like to continue the discussion on Twitter, please tag at 3IE News and hashtag WWGS2020 in your tweets. You can also subscribe to email updates from 3IE by visiting our website, 3ieimpact.org, to learn more about future events in the Evidence Dialogue series. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day.